Tēnā koutou katoa. It's Chris. You're with Arrow FM 92.7, and it's the Political Pulse. And it's just gone midday, and welcome to the program. And to those of you who are watching via YTV or YouTube, greetings, kia ora. So, this is a program about politics, public policy. It's a program about people. It's a program about ideas. It's a program where you don't get lectured by me. It's a program where we look at the background, what's going on, try and understand better how our system works. If there is a premise on which it's based, it is a view that I hold that politics can be a force for good, that politics often gets a bad rap, and that most people who go into politics do so for the right reasons. And politics, whatever the motives of people who go into it, really does matter, because politicians, public servants, these people pass laws, make decisions, and they impact on you and me. So what a time it's been for politics. I guess the overwhelming feeling reflecting on the last week is, for me at least, one of a degree of sadness. We are well and truly now into the election contest, and we would expect the contest to be robust. We would hope, at least I hope, and I know others hope, that it's a contest of ideas, it's a contest about policies, it's a contest about who has the best platform, program, manifesto to deliver what it is that the team of 5 million most needs in terms of the economic, social, environmental well-being. So, but it hasn't been a week really where we've seen much of the high road. We've seen, unfortunately, low road. It's reflecting on last week's episode of the program where we looked at trust and ethics and what's happened since. Won't go into the details, but for an editorial position on what has been going on, it worries me, it concerns me deeply that what we may have seen and what we need to avoid is the use of a mental health defence to attempt to justify actions by individuals where really mental health is not the underlying driver or cause. There are lots of folk out there doing it hard, battling mental health. There are some people who don't win that fight. Far too many members of our community don't win the fight against mental health. And so it does the community no good when we see mental health being weaponised, where the ready excuse for some kind of inappropriate behaviour is, oh, that person was suffering from mental health issues. Now, if a person is suffering from mental health issues, if it's authentic, it's real, then that should be respected. But what shouldn't be respected, in fact, what I believe is unconscionable, is where one creates or uses a mental health defence in a totally expedient, instrumental manner. So let's respect the fact that mental health issues do come up, but let's also respect the fact that it debases politics, it debases the currency of politics when people have recourse to that defence, and it's not in fact required. So, a little homily to start with, a little bit of editorialising. Today's been an interesting day in other respects because we've seen, and we're not going to get into it too much at this stage, we might with our guest, the resignation of a cabinet minister. That is a rare event, relatively rare event. I sense that with this particular cabinet minister, he may well also not be seeking re-election to his seat, and it's the seat of Palmerston North. And we may well talk to our guest today about that issue. Our guest today is Professor Richard Shaw from Massey University, and I've invited Richard on really to talk about our electoral system and how we come to have the kind of electoral system we have and what its strengths are as compared to what we had before and what some of the weaknesses are. Because I think it's important, A, that people vote. If you haven't get on the roll, get on the roll. You know, that orange man on the TV, listen to what he's saying. Register, get on the roll. But it's important that once you've done that, that you engage with the issues, obviously, but it's also that you understand the nature of the system that's operating in terms of how you vote, how many votes you have, and how you can use those votes. So Rich is going to come along and we're going to talk about those kinds of issues. Before we do, some music. It's New Zealand music again. It's live music. This is a song that was released back in 1981. Now, 1981 is a pretty special year in New Zealand politics, political history. It was an election year, and it was also a year where we saw a tour by a South African rugby team, and we saw massive civil protests against that tour. Those of us who were around at the time will remember that. And I'd say, as an aside, I don't have an awful lot of time for people who really were around at that time and were adult but don't have any recollection of it. It's kind of, how could you miss what was going on? Anyway, back to the music. And the music came from a band, an indie band, and they, the name of that band, Blam Blam Blam. Yes, Blam Blam Blam. 1981, they released a couple of numbers that, were quite kind of popular, got a bit of airtime. No doubt a few people were dancing to them. The one I'm going to play now for you folk is a number entitled, wonderful title, this, Don't Fight It, Marsha, It's Bigger Than Both of Us. And we're not going to watch the Blam 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 version of it. One of the three members of Blam Blam Blam, Don McGlashan, went on obviously to do wonderful things and still does wonderful things. And I found this video clip and it's from actually early this year. And it's from a community event held in Newtown in Wellington. So this is Don McGlashan going solo with his version of Don't Fight It, Marsha, It's Bigger Than Both of Us. So that was Don McGlashan, and Don't Fight It, Marcia, it's bigger than both of us. And now, all going well, it's my pleasure to invite Richard Shaw, Professor Richard Shaw, on the program. Are you there, Richard?
I am, mate. I am here.
That's good. Thanks for joining us. I haven't been able to give you a proper introduction. So Professor Richard Shaw is Professor of Politics at Massey University, based in Palmerston North, and has a variety of responsibilities there. Richard, thanks very much for giving us of your time today. The issue I really wanted to focus on was our electoral system and how we came to get it. What was the old one like? Was it broken? What have we ended up with? Is it fit for purpose? But before we get into that, and without getting into the weeds, momentous day in New Zealand politics today, resignation of a cabinet minister. And moreover, the former cabinet minister, who was also the MP for the electorate in which I am registered to vote. So I'm sitting in my office in Palmerston North, and as you can well imagine, Chris, the various means of communication are buzzing frantically as people digest this latest news release from the Beehive, Prime Minister's unscheduled press release, resignation of Ian Lees-Galloway, standing aside, just another day in what's been a frantic couple of weeks. Not that I'm suggesting there are parallels beyond a limited point between Galloway's situation and what's been going on in the National Party caucus. Although I think that'll be another conversation around men behaving badly. But yes, it's a big day here. Yeah, and what's your assessment? I mean, having worked in the Wellington environment, there's a sort of tacit agreement between the press gallery and members of parliament, cabinet ministers, their staff, that some areas are no-go areas. Typically families don't go anywhere near it. And some secrets are kept. That's part of the deal that's reached. Any risk at all that we're seeing a kind of breakdown of that agreement, or is the Ian Lees-Galloway situation, given his portfolio, given what it is suggested occurred, that the actions of the Prime Minister were justified in this case, and we're not seeing a sort of open season on the private lives of our politicians?
Oh, yeah, that was one of the questions that was put to the Prime Minister at a press conference early this afternoon. I don't think, well, several responses. I don't think that we can move from this specific situation to the conclusion that it's now open season on the private lives of politicians. I don't think that's, you can't draw that conclusion on the basis of one particular instance. Had Ian Lees-Galloway not had the mix of portfolios and workplace relations in particular that he had, would the Prime Minister have forced the issue in this particular way? I'm not sure that she would have. I think there is a question to be asked about the use of power, the exercise, the misexercise of power in the contexts of relationships between ministers of the Crown and their employees. That is just unavoidable. So in this day and age, the French have some connections with France. As you know, the French have long held the same kind of social contract. You just stay away from members of parliament and members of the executive. Former French President François Mitterrand famously had a partner for most of the years that he was in the Élysée Palace. Didn't particularly bother the French. Didn't seem to particularly bother his partner at the time. Actually, his wife, both women were at François Mitterrand's funeral, maintained a cordial relationship. I mean, that's a very different set of circumstances. But I think when in the current cultural climate, the suggestion that questions of institutional power, gender relations, and so on get mixed up, and you have a relationship between what I understand was a younger staffer who then worked in Lees-Galloway's office and the minister, then that is going to attract attention. But I don't think it means that there's open season, and of course neither should there be, because what's critical not to lose sight of is that there has been a woman working the family rounds at home to enable Lees-Galloway to build the career that he's built as a member for Palmerston North and more latterly as a minister. and there's no suggestion there will be, sort of people door-stopping her in Palmerston North. But I think it is entirely appropriate to ask questions about that kind of behaviour. I'm not sure if that's really a very sensible response, Chris.
No, that's really helpful. And as you say, I think one needs to clearly differentiate what happened around the, former member for Rangitata, Andrew Falloon, and what's happening in this case that's broken today. In my opening comments in today's program, I kind of editorialised a wee bit by saying that it disturbs me to see the weaponising of mental health and its use as a defence in a calculated, considered, instrumental, expedient way that debases the currency of politics and does a gross disservice to, I think, folk in the community who are kind of living with mental health issues and who deserve better.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. Chief Executive of the Mental Health Foundation came out this morning with more or less those comments. RNZ's Catriona Cat McLennan has got a good piece on questions of diversity within the National Party's caucus, which covers some of these and a range of other issues. And she absolutely makes that point as well, that the what appears to have been the crude instrumental use of mental health as a shield for grossly inappropriate, improper, potentially criminal behaviour by the former member for Rangitata is just, particularly in this country. We know most of us that we are scoring highly on all the wrong league tables internationally when it comes to questions of mental health and ill health and the various dimensions thereof. So it's cynical. I think to use mental health as in the way that it was in the Falloon case. Part of the problem with that is it then gets generalised in the way that we do in this country. Our political discourse tends towards the absolute. So, so the entire political class becomes tainted with this particular brush, which is also something we need to guard against, because it isn't the case.
No.
That all MPs behave that way. It isn't the case that all caucuses behave that way. So really careful that we guard against that.
Absolutely. Okay, back to the basis on which I invited you to come on the program, and you were generous enough to say yes. You've researched this issue. In fact, I think it was part of your doctoral research a number of years ago, and you've you've written on it subsequently. So it's about the electoral system. So on our television screens now, we've got orange men exhorting us to register, get on the roll, and we've got background information on the referendums that we'll exercise decisions on the 19th of September. And we've got an electoral system, MMP. What's the story, Richard, of the genesis of MMP? So maybe invite you in a minute to tell us a little bit about it, but how did we end up with it?
Mate, how long have we got? How long's your show? I brought you a sleeping bag. We could be here for weeks. Well, we got to it formally we ran it for the first time in 1996. Scroll back a couple of years, we got to it officially through two referenda, one which was held in conjunction with the 93 general election, the indicative referendum in September of 1992, which was a step along the way. But I think to understand why we have the arrangements that we presently do, we need to go much, much, much further back. We used to have what the political scientists, and you know this, as well as I do, if not better, a plurality electoral system. We called it colloquially first past the post, which was a pretty good way of characterising it. It essentially meant that at the constituency or electorate level, to win the contest, you had to be the first person past the post being a simple plurality, the single largest number of votes. You didn't have to have a majority of all voters in the seat of Masterton or Wairarapa or Palmerston North or wherever. You just had to have one more valid vote than the next highest ranking candidate. And quite often in New Zealand, that meant that typically, in fact, members of Parliament would win constituency contests with 40%, high 40s. Sometimes you'd get a majority of vote, but very often you'd win a seat on the basis of a minority of support from the population, the voting population in your seat. When you amplify that up to the national level, we had a long history across the better part of the 21st century of having elections which were won by typically the National Party, less frequently the Labour Party, on the basis of a minority of all valid votes cast in the nation. From memory, the last time that a political party won a general election in Aotearoa, New Zealand, with a majority of all valid votes cast was 1951 snap election called by the national government. It was returned with 51% of the vote. So we have a long history of electing governments which are not supported by a majority of people who vote at elections. So there's that part of the story. The second part of the story is sort of a pointy-head one, really. It has to do with the design of our institutions, and in particular the way in which the political executive, the cabinet, we call it the government, is drawn from and responsible to the House of Representatives, what we classically call the Parliament. In other words, to form a government, you need to control one way or another a majority of all seats in the House. They don't have to come from your party, they can come from a range of parties. You just have to have that threshold. Then you go to the Governor-General and say, look, I've got the confidence of the House, away we go. Under the old first past the post arrangements, what typically happened was a single party, National or Labour, would control a majority of seats in the Parliament on the basis of a minority of all votes count, and then they could whip off and do, they could run a policy agenda, they could implement policy, they could change policy, largely without checks and balances. Not entirely, I kind of overstate the case, and often that was entirely uncontentious. But if you think back to some of those radical reforming governments of the left and the right across the 80s and 90s, I think we reached a point in the early 1990s where sufficient people just got pissed off with the behaviour of governments and the behaviour of governments which were supported by a minority of voters to push for electoral change. We had a couple of pretty extreme examples in that. 1981 comes to mind. The Social Credit Party polled 21% of the vote from memory, in return for which they got 2 seats, Bruce Beetham and Gary Knapp, Rangatike and East Coast Bays. Now, under the electoral system that we have now, 20% of the vote will get you a hell of a lot more than two MPs. So there was that one. And then in 79, the election in 1979, the Labour Party won the popular vote but lost the election. That happened on a couple of occasions in our history. So all of that stuff sort of swirls together with a range of other things, and people, eventually sufficient people think, look, we need to revise our electoral arrangements. A couple of other dates in there, the Royal Commission on the Electoral System, 1986, report about a better democracy. That's important. David Longie's performances on television, where he appears to promise a referendum that wasn't part of Labour Party policy, that's important. But I think the big ticket items are, you have an electoral system which is inherently unfair, mapped onto constitutional arrangements which give New Zealand governments very considerable political clout. And eventually that leads to an historical juncture where we change one of those but not the other.
Right. And somewhere in all that, we've got a Royal Commission as well, haven't we? And I seem to recall that the Royal Commission used a set of criteria kind of to test the merits or otherwise of different electoral systems.
Yes. We have the Royal Commission, which sits in it reports in 1986. And it uses 10 tests, and they are things, what the Royal Commission does, it looks at 4 separate electoral arrangements, one of which is the current set of arrangements, the old first past the post system, and it asks essentially 10 questions. How do these different electoral systems stack up on things like fairness between political parties, effective Māori representation, effective representation of people in constituencies, effective political parties, the legitimacy. So it has 10 threshold tests, and it's a sizable document. It runs to several hundred pages, and what they do is they kind of stress test these 4 different electoral systems against those 10 criteria, and reach a conclusion, which is that MMP, mixed member proportional representation, loosely based on the West German model of the time, is the best one when assessed against those 10 criteria.
Okay, and we have two referendums. What the
Yep.
first one is indicative, and that is what do we need to do we need to change? And at that stage, were we asked, in fact, to indicate a preference across those four, or?
Yeah, for memory. From memory, there were two questions there. Do we want to change? If so, which one do we want to change to? The turnout from memory is not. It's not spectacularly high. It's not bad. We've got a bit of a history of referenda. They tend to fall over. They don't get up. We've had referenda on a range of things, including, provisions for selling alcohol linked to the parliamentary term. They tend not to elicit significant turnout. 55%, I think, of registered voters voted in that indicative referendum in 1992. At a very sizable majority of those indicate that they want change and that they specifically want the MMP system, which the Royal Commission had recommended some years earlier. Fast forward 80 months or so, a few less into the election the following year, 1993, and alongside the general election as a binding referendum. So the result of this is binding upon the new or returning administration, and there is a 54-46 split in support for MMP vis-a-vis retention of first past the post. So it's a 10 percentage point gap. It's a pretty sizable gap between the two camps in terms of other head-to-head contests in New Zealand politics. The decision has legitimacy because it's a clear majority, and turnout was high 80s in that particular election, as I recall. And then it's implemented for the first time in 1996.
Okay, so we get the passage of the Electoral Act 1993, and we get a new electoral system, and we put it in place for the 1996 election. So the question then is, it's a German-style mixed member proportional system.
Yep.
So two questions really. Given the constraints of time, what is it, and has it done the business?
Well, the what is it is it's kind of a clunky title, mixed member proportional representation. Basically, it's an electoral system of two halves. So you have a number of members of parliament who continue to represent seats or electorates or constituencies, and those contests are still run on a first past the post basis. Then you have another set of members of parliament who are list MPs who come into the parliament on the basis of a particular political party's support on the party vote, and that becomes a critical thing. You win 10% of the party vote, then you take 12 MPs, 10% of 120 into the parliament. That's the rough mathematical formula. Is the number of seats that you have in the parliament is a more or less direct reflection of the proportion of the votes that you secure right out there across the nation. So you have two sources of MPs, because we quite wanted we like the idea that we have access to our local MPs. That's part of the criterion that speaks to effective parties, but also effective constituency representation. So we keep that connection. Actually, and so I'm just going to digress a wee bit, mate, if that's okay. Something has happened though. In 1996, in the first MMP election, there were 60 constituency MPs and there were 60 list MPs, and that ratio has changed. When we go to the polls this year, there will be 72 electorate MPs and only 48 list MPs. So the capacity of the parliament to deliver, actually this does go to your second question, the capacity of the electoral system, rather, and the parliament to deliver on a couple of those original 10 criteria has been just, it's sort of attenuated a wee bit, it's chipped away a wee bit, because the party lists have been really important, particularly in terms of the presence of women parliamentarians and, to a slightly lesser extent, Māori parliamentarians as well. So the fewer list MPs we have relative to the number of constituency MPs, the more constrained becomes our capacity to achieve the effective representation of the kinds of groups of people who don't classically win parties' candidate selection processes at the electorate level.
Right. Okay, a couple of other issues. I mean, MMP has been reviewed, and I can't recall on what basis, but I do recall, in fact, it may well be the leader of the opposition currently at one stage indicated that given that parties in her assessment, couldn't agree she wasn't going to be running some kind of kumbaya discussion to effect agreement. So one issue, the threshold, 5%. So a party needs to secure 5%. Is 5%, is it set appropriately? Is it too high, too low? What's your sense on that one?
Well, the Royal Commission's recommendation was that it be set at 4%. 5% is quite a stiff bar, quite a high bar to reach for some of those smaller parties. The original recommendation was that we follow what occurred in the Bundestag in West Germany and set that threshold at 4%. And given the German historical experience, that was felt to be the level at which you could maintain a reasonable diversity of representation of what we used to call minor parties without allowing into your institutions of elected representation fringe parties of the left, or particularly the National Socialist right. In the event, our Electoral Act bumped that up a percentage point to 5%. So that thing that you're referring to, the Electoral Act, the 93 Act, had an inbuilt review by a parliamentary select committee after 5 years. What occurred in 2012 was an electoral commission review, and I don't recall what the instigation was for that. The trigger might have been a request from the previous minister. I just don't recall what kicked that off. But that particular commission report made two recommendations. One was that the 5% threshold be dropped back to 4%. And the second was that what we in this country call the coattail rule be done away with. The coattail rule is the thing that means if you win one constituency seat, whether it's a general seat or a seat on the Māori roll, then you take into the parliament with you whatever percentage of MPs is appropriate given your performance on the party vote. So you might win only 4% or 3% or 2% of the party vote. But if you win the seat of Epsom, then you take an equivalent number of MPs in with you. So you have situations where political parties, New Zealand First, way back, the Christian Coalition at the first MMP election, get quite close to the 5% margin, but don't make it over the line into Parliament. And then you have a party like United Future New Zealand and its various incarnations, or the ACT Party, which is probably the best known example, or the Māori Party, who win a seat, but take a small handful of parliamentarians in as well. And that offends against many people's sense of fairness and judgment. It probably offends against some of the tests that the Royal Commission set down as well. And you're right, the current leader of the opposition, Judith Collins, was Minister of Justice, and in 2013 she declined to implement the two recommendations in the Electoral Commission's report. Okay.
Now, what about gaming? Because it's obviously implicit in what you're saying, and you've mentioned a couple of seats there. Epsom is the cause célèbre, I think, for what's known as the kind of cup of tea arrangement. I think that comes from the fact that the leader of the National Party has a cup of tea very, very publicly with the ACT candidate, and you decode that and it says, all right, our message to the National Party voters in the seat of Epsom is elect the ACT candidate, but give us your party vote. And it strikes me that, other parties maybe haven't done that, but Auckland Central would be a strong candidate at the moment for maybe the parties on the centre-left to have a chat about whether or not a cup of tea might be in order. Does it debase the integrity of the system that it allows for these cups of tea?
In the main, I think it does. Although I'm not sure about the extent to which the offensiveness of the cup of tea arrangement applies these days. My sense is that most people, certainly the case in the Māori electorates, it has long been the case up there that you've had a party like the Māori Party quite explicitly saying to voters of Te Tai Tokerau or wherever the case may be, look, give Labour your party vote by all means, but give us your electorate vote, 2 for the price of 1. So
Yep.
it's a similar, it's a very different process. It's much less codified and much more explicit. But the logic that the Māori Party have used in the past, and they'll do it again on September the 19th, I'm sure this year, utilises the same part of electoral law, but does so in a quite different spirit, I think. Similarly, what will happen, I mean, it will be blindingly clear, I'd imagine, to virtually everybody who's registered to vote in Auckland Central, that if you are on the left, centre-left, you would look at voting strategically. You'd split your vote, and you might give your constituency vote to Chloe Swarbrick, and you might give your party vote to the Labour Party, or whatever the case may be. There are various permutations and calculations there. But I think it is absolutely the case that well, I was going to say there remains a strong sentiment. There certainly has been very strong sentiment in the past. That particular legislative provision provides for gaming is a little less than explicit, and we can do without it. And it creates kinks in terms of the representation of political parties. You can see why New Zealand First might have felt aggrieved in the 1999 election, was it?
Mm-hmm.
The following one?
Mm-hmm.
I can't recall, where they just fell short of that 5% margin and dropped out of the House.
Yeah.
Was it 4.7? Yeah. And the ACT Party came in with a handful of MPs having won significantly less public support across the nation. So it's an anomaly and it's a wrinkle. And my own view is that it's something that we could well do without.
Okay, so getting into sort of brass tacks, obviously this is a system where you've got 2 votes. You've got the vote for your electorate MP and you've got the vote for the party. And it's the case, isn't it, that it's the party vote really that I mean, don't want to sort of say that the one vote's more important than the other, but the party vote is the one that really counts in terms of the composition of the parliament.
Yep, except in those weird circumstances where you have a small party who pick up a single electorate seat and win just about no party votes whatsoever, and that has been the case with ACT in the past, and it certainly was in 2017. In every other circumstance, in the overwhelming majority of cases you could imagine, it's the party vote that determines the composition of the parliament. If the proportion of all seats that you win in the New Zealand Parliament is a more or less direct result of the proportion of the party vote that you win. And I think the advantage of that, part of the thinking behind the Royal Commission report anyway, was that it gives you, as a voter, just a little bit more influence and a little bit more stretch and a little bit more flexibility. You might live in a very, very safe blue seat or a very, very safe Labour seat, one that's been controlled by one of those parties for a gazillion years, in which case your vote for the party of your preference really doesn't make a great deal of difference. Under their current arrangements, you can shape the composition of the parliament because the party vote applies right across the nation. It's completely blind to matters of geography, and the party vote is the one that determines the shape of the parliament. Just one other thing that we probably should add here, unlike a number of, in fact, the majority of the world's established democracies, we don't have direct executive elections in this country. So we don't elect the minister, we don't elect the prime minister, we elect a parliament, and then it's for the parliament to determine the formation of the next government. And so our influence as voters is indirect. And I think that influence has been sharpened up quite appreciably by the introduction of MMP. Because... Sorry, go on.
No, I think that point's well made. The time we got remaining, obviously first past the post gave a single party majority government. You've made that point, and the notion of the elective dictatorship. So that fuels the concern, and we get a change. What you're picking under MMP? Give you a hypothetical. So we do end up with a party under MMP that secures a majority in the parliament. Do you think that notwithstanding, the onus is possibly on parties these days, even when they don't need it, to look at multi-party arrangements in government?
Yes, I do. I absolutely think that's the case. If an election had been held this morning at 9 o'clock, things may be a little bit different now. I'm not sure they will be, but if we had an election this morning, in all probability, if you averaged out the few polls that have been taken in recent weeks and months, the likelihood that the Labour Party would have a working majority within its own massed ranks of the caucus would be pretty high, I would think. The Roy Morgan poll that was released last week had Labor sitting at 55% from memory, the Greens at 9%. So the combined sort of centre-left bloc was at 65 or so percent. It's astronomical by New Zealand standards. Even if that poll was the one that applies on September the 19th, I would think there'd be a very strong incentive for the Prime Minister and senior members of the Labor caucus to strike an arrangement with the Green Party. And I say that simply because, well, it's not really simple at all. Over the last 40 or 50 years, you look at the ways in which New Zealanders spread their votes around for all of the different reasons that we know influence the choices that voters make when they go into the ballot booth, and there has been a noticeable diminution in the combined Labor national share of the vote. It hasn't collapsed by any stretch of the imagination, although in the early days of MMP, when we had parliaments with 7 parties or 8 parties in them. I think 8 was the most we've had. I'm not sure. We're down to 5 now. So Labor and National between them still dominate the electoral landscape. But increasingly, voters are shopping around and they're changing their voting preferences between electoral cycles. So the notion of the disaggregation of kind of monolithic vote for the Labor Party or the National Party, that doesn't apply quite so much as it might have done in previous generations. So the likelihood of any political party having a string of percentage performances in the low 50% is pretty minimal. So you'd want to, with an eye to the long game, build up your political relationships, and they have become. I mean, they're pretty clear these days. Labor, Greens, the National Party, and ACT. New Zealand First has often been the joker in the pack, although it looks as if it might fall out of the pack entirely, depending on the seat in Northland. That becomes critical, probably less so than Auckland Central, but it's one you'd want to keep an eye on. So yes, my sense is that simply because voters are a little less fixed in their preferences now than they might have been in early generations, that parties would look to build those relationships. And I think there's something more than that, though. I think we've had a quarter of a century. People have grown into their adult political consciousness under MMP, and increasingly few of us remember what it was like under single party majority governments. And the language and the practices and the conventions and the sentiments and the discourse around coalitions of various kinds is now a feature of our landscape here. In the main, we're pretty comfortable with it, I think. There are clearly exceptions, and I'm sure there are people out there who would love to see a return to the days of first past the post, and I'm most certainly not one of those. So, to your question, yes, I think there are all kinds of incentives for that kind of partnership building over the long haul. Right.
Richard, time's the enemy. I'm enjoying this conversation. We could keep on going for quite a while, but no doubt the wonderful man who runs this station, Michael Wilson, would knock on the door and say, Chris, it's time to finish up. At the start of the program, I played your suggestion, Don't Fight It, Marcia, it's bigger than both of us.
Yes,
and I was looking at the lyrics, and quoting from the lyrics, there's 5 blue figures on a white circle. They're making agreements. They're keeping each other in line. And I wondered, because I'd never looked at the lyrics, whether your affection for that in some ways was in part because it's a song about love, but it's also, if you look carefully at it, it's a song about, multi-party government. Who knows?
It's exactly what it was. Don McGlashan, and I mean, you and I have had these conversations in other contexts in the past. Don McGlashan is one of the world's, and certainly this country's, most extraordinary storytellers and poets and songwriters, and he foresaw it all. He saw it all coming long before we did.
In 1981, no less, and 1981 was a fairly significant year as well.
Yes.
Always important, I think, to ask people who were adults in 1981 what they were doing.
I can't remember. Can you? Some of us can't remember, apparently.
I can remember. Look, and this has been memorable for me. You take care. Thanks so much for joining us, Richard.
Pleasure.
It's been an absolute privilege and a pleasure talking with you as ever. So that
all mine.
That was Professor Richard Shaw of Massey University on MMP and other things. Okay, so we're running over time. And I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Richard Shaw. I hope for those of you who were looking at the MMP system and wondering about how we got to get it and whether it's good, bad or different, you've learned something from it. And we'll be back next week, same time, same place. And next week, we might actually have a little bit of a look at racism in Aotearoa, New Zealand. In the meantime, ka kite anō, be well, take care.